Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NAA's second session in our April is Fair Housing Month educational series. Today's session is to verify or not emotional support animals and other unique requests. My name is James Swart, and I'm the Director of Education and Leadership Development here at the National Apartment Association. As a reminder, today's session will be recorded and available for viewing on demand in the next couple of days. We've saved some time at the end of today's session for live Q&A. If you have questions throughout Terry's presentation, you can submit those using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. Before we dive into today's session, I wanted to make you aware of a couple of resources that NAA offers. First is our Emotional Support Animals Toolkit, an ebook that informs industry professionals on their fair housing obligations when an applicant or resident requests an assistance animal and helps housing providers navigate fraudulent requests for emotional support animals, a great supplement to our presentation today. The second resource on NAA's online learning platform, Visto, there's a fair housing professional program. Links to both of these will be provided in the chat. Before I turn the floor over to Terry, I want to remind everyone that NAA does have an antitrust compliance statement that is available to view on our website. I also want to remind everyone that the information and opinions contained in this presentation are for general interest and informational purposes only and are not intended to constitute specific legal, commercial, or other professional advice. With that, I am excited to introduce Terry Kitay with Baker, Donelson, Bearman, Caldwell, and Berkowitz, who will be our presenter today. Terry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it. And James, if I could ask that you would monitor the chat, if there's any questions that come up that you think need to be addressed right then, if you would let me know, I'd appreciate it.
Happy to do that.
Great. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Fair Housing Month. Next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about emotional support animals, and you can go ahead and give me the whole slide. Emotional support animals, of course, arise as an issue under the Fair Housing Act's protection from disability discrimination. So I just want to have a couple of slides just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about with regard to disability. Disability is defined under the Fair Housing Act as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And that is pretty much the same definition in most of the states. This is the federal law definition, but most of the states have the same definition. There are some that broaden it even more than that. But typically when someone is asking for an animal in housing that they are not calling a pet, it's as a result of a disability. There's a disability-related need for the animal. Disability under the Fair Housing Act also protects people who were formerly disabled, who are assumed to be disabled but aren't, or who are associated with a disabled person. And other than being associated with a disabled person, the other definitions probably don't have a whole lot of application to requests for animals. Associated with a disabled person could mean a regular visitor who has an assistance animal, or a member of the household who's maybe not on the lease but has an assistance animal and needs that animal, needs permission for that animal. So we'll talk about those specific circumstances in just a minute. Next, please. So housing providers under the Fair Housing Act are required to make changes in rules, policies, practices, and procedures if that change is necessary to allow a person with a disability full use and enjoyment of the housing. And of course, you know that that's called a reasonable accommodation. Under the Fair Housing Act, you must make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities when they're necessary. And making changes in your usual and customary rules about animals or pets is typically considered to be a reasonable accommodation, although there are some limits on that, and we'll talk today about some of the boundaries of those limits. Next, please. So an assistance animal is an accommodation. Go ahead and on the next ones, please. Full slide. An assistance animal is defined as any animal that is needed because of a disability. there are different kinds of assistance animals, and we have to treat them somewhat differently under the Fair Housing Act. One kind is a service animal. A service animal is a specific term of art, comes from the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it is a subset of assistance animals. Service animals are individually trained to perform a task or to do work for a person with a disability related to that disability. Most of the time, a service animal must be a dog. The one exception to that is what we see in the picture, a miniature horse. In some circumstances where it's reasonable to allow it, a miniature horse can be a service animal as well. But again, it would have to be individually trained to perform a task or do work that is disability related. On the other hand, a support animal, an emotional support animal, an ESA, is any animal that is necessary for the person with a disability because of the disability that's not a service animal. So support animals can include ESAs, it can include therapy animals, comfort animals. There's all kinds of names that people use, but basically it's any animal that's needed because of a disability, but it's not a service animal. And the thing about support animals is they're very different from service animals because they don't have to be individually trained to do anything, that they are beneficial for the person with a disability solely because of their presence. Just being there is the benefit that's derived from a support animal. Support animals do not have the same species limitation that service animals do. We know from the DOJ regulations on service animals that a service animal is typically a dog, and in some cases, when it's reasonable to allow, it might be a miniature horse. But there is no species limitation on support animals, other than that they should be commonly domesticated animals that are typically kept in the home for pleasure rather than commercial purposes. So you typically won't see a support monkey. You won't see a support snake. You won't see a support ostrich. But they can be dogs, cats, birds, turtles. There's any animal commonly kept in the home for pleasure. Not barnyard animals, though, are typically not considered to be support animals. Next slide, please. Both service animals and support animals can be a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act that must be permitted in housing under the right circumstances. So the person who's asking you to keep their animal in housing because of a disability doesn't have to specifically say, well, he's my service dog, or he's my support and my emotional support dog. They don't have to classify it that way, but you need to know which it is and ask the right questions, because the way you verify, the way you determine whether the animal is allowed to be there will depend on whether it is a service animal or a support animal. Next slide, please. So requests for actual service animals are pretty easy to deal with. Generally, what the animal is trained to do is pretty apparent from looking at the animal with the person that is asking for that animal. An example would be guide dogs for people who have vision impairments. You know, what we used to call seeing eye dogs. It's pretty obvious that that animal is guiding the person with a disability, and that it's trained to do that. So generally, if something is a service animal, it is pretty evident just from looking at the animal and looking at the animal interacting with the person that it is a service animal. Service animals are not required to be professionally trained. They can be trained by the person who is using the animal. And they're not required to be certified. There is no official, quote, certification for service animals. But generally, they tend to be very well trained and therefore very well behaved. And you will not have issues of behavioral or conduct issues with a service animal that's allowed on site. in most cases, because they are just very well behaved. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a species limitation. It has to be a dog or potentially a miniature horse, but you won't have a service animal snake, which I am eternally grateful for. Next, please. Emotional support animals, though, requests for those are a little more complicated. First of all, it can be any of a number of kinds of animals. Again, there is no species limitation other than it should be an animal that is commonly domesticated and kept in the home for purposes of pleasure rather than commercial purposes. They are not required to be trained to do anything or to be trained at all. They are, in terms of training, no different from a pet. They are functionally exactly like a pet, but we don't call them a pet. And the disability-related need for an emotional support animal will, in most cases, not be readily observable. You won't be able to tell just by looking at the person or looking at the animal that this animal is needed because of a disability. And that's where verification comes in. If you're not able to determine from just readily observing a person that there is either a disability involved or that there is a disability related need for the accommodation that they're requesting, here an emotional support animal, you have the right to seek third-party verification of that request. Unfortunately, there is a whole cottage industry that has grown up lately that issues so-called verification letters or prescription letters for emotional support animals. Many people will use the request for an emotional support animal to get out of paying customarily applicable pet fees for their pets or pet rent or pet deposits. There is such a thing as an emotional support animal. It is a real thing, and I don't dispute that at all. But I do think that there a lot of times we as an industry are faced with requests from people who really wouldn't qualify for an emotional support animal, but are using the request for an accommodation to avoid these kinds of fees or to be able to bring in an animal that would not otherwise be allowed. So I hope that what we're going to talk about today will help you a little bit in determining when the request is genuine and when you do need to approve it. Next, please. So once you have a request for an animal, and this would be true for any accommodation request, not just animal requests, but once you have a request, determine first, is the existence of the disability readily observable? Can you tell just by looking at the person as a reasonable person that there is in fact a disability here? You don't have to know what the disability is, but that there is a disability. And then you have to determine if the disability related need for the accommodation requested here for the animal is readily observable. If the answer to both of those questions is yes, you can simply evaluate the reasonableness and necessity for the request, and you don't need to make any further inquiry of the person who's making the request. However, if the answer to either question is no, you have the right to engage in a third-party verification process. So you have the right to verify, if they're not readily observable, the existence of a disability and the disability-related need for the accommodation that is requested. Next, please. If you need to get verification, if the disability and the disability-related need for the accommodation is not readily observable, you can seek third-party verification, but you're limited in what you can ask. You can't go into a whole inquiry into the person's medical history. You can't ask for medical records. You can't ask anything about the nature or severity of the disability. What you can ask, though, are the following. You can ask, is this person disabled as defined by the Fair Housing Act? So you need to know what the definition of a disability under the Fair Housing Act is: a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So I would recommend, if you're using a form for verification, that when you ask, is this person disabled, it's a yes or no question. It's not asking what the disability is. but that you include that definition of disability so that the person who's filling out the form knows what you're asking. Next, you can ask, does this person need an accommodation, meaning a change in our policies, practices, or procedures because of the disability? And again, that's a yes or no question. Third is, what's the accommodation needed? You can ask that. You may already know, in which case you could say this person has requested to have Tiny the Rottweiler as an assistance animal in her apartment. And then you would say the next question, do you have a therapeutic relationship with this person for reasons other than providing the verification for this accommodation request? So what we're trying to do is here confirm that the person who is the verifier is a, quote, reliable source. We need someone who is a third party professional who has an ongoing or has had an ongoing relationship with the person with regard to the disability and didn't just establish the relationship solely to complete this verification, or in the case of the online letters, didn't establish the relationship solely to provide the letter following a short interview, which is typically what happens with those online services. So you are allowed to ask about the presence of a therapeutic relationship, about whether the relationship is there solely for the purpose of providing this verification. If it is, that person is not considered to be a reliable source, and the verification is not going to be sufficient for your purposes. And then there's a question that I recommend that you ask. But realize what the purpose of it is, and that is, would you testify under oath to this information? The only reason I suggest that you ask this question is not because the answer matters. The answer could be yes, it could be no, it could be yes only if you pay my extraordinary fee. Whatever it is, it makes absolutely no difference what the answer is. But what we are asking with this question, the point we're getting across is for the verifier. So the verifier knows that this is serious information and it should be taken seriously, and that the verifier could potentially have to testify about this. So again, it doesn't matter what the verifier says. If the verifier says no, that's fine. If the verifier says yes, that's fine. But have that question there just to send that message to the verifier that we need to be truthful here. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But remember, it's not a reason to deny the accommodation solely because the person verifying said no, they would not testify under oath. Next, please. So who is this verifier that's going to be the reliable source? It's not mom. It's not dad. It is a third party. But it doesn't have to be an MD, a medical doctor. It can be any of a number of professionals who have a relationship with the person requesting the accommodation with regard to the disability, who can be reliable sources. For instance, a social worker, when we're talking about emotional support animals, a social worker, a psychologist, a therapist. These are not MDs, but they are appropriate sources of verification of the need for an assistance animal. A chiropractor probably is not a reliable source for verification of an assistance animal, because a chiropractor won't be treating the person for the symptoms of the disability related to the need for an animal. For example, there's also you will run into people who will say, you can't ask me anything about this. If I tell you that my dog is a service animal and is trained to notify me when the doorbell rings, you can't ask me anything else. That's self-verification, and that's all you can ask. Well, that may be true under the ADA for a service animal. It's not true for a support animal. So if the request is for an emotional support animal, don't feel like you get bullied into saying, I can't ask anything else. You absolutely can ask for third-party verification, although it is limited to the topics that we just discussed. So we want it to be a reliable third-party professional who is familiar with the disability, and not just the disability in general, but the disability in this particular individual. So if you have someone who says, I'm very familiar with all the literature on emotional support animals and the benefit that people with disabilities derive from emotional support animals, and I know you've seen that language because that's the form language the online services use, that is not establishing that this person has the requisite personal knowledge about the person who's asking for the animal. It needs to be specific to the individual. And that's what the question about a relationship with the person other than filling out this form is all about. And again, this is very, very important. Never ask anything about the nature or severity of the disability. Don't ask what the disability is. You're never requesting medical records. If you get medical records, you should return them. And that's it. Next. So what are some special issues with ESAs? Well, we have people who request multiple animals. So it's entirely possible that you could have more than one service animal. You know, maybe not all that efficient, but sometimes one animal is trained to do one thing for a disability and another animal is trained to do something else for a disability. Those would be multiple service animals, and if it's reasonable to do so, you probably have to approve those. But think about an ESA. What is an ESA? It is beneficial by its presence. It isn't trained to do anything. And so there's really very little possibility of a need for more than one emotional support animal. Because what is one emotional support animal going to do that the other one couldn't do, right? So it's really, really rare that you're going to have a valid request for multiple emotional support animals. You know, you would certainly have to give them the opportunity to show you why it's necessary that you have more than one. But I haven't seen a request yet for multiple support animals that I felt had met the bar for approval. Requests for unique animals like Betty White and her snake here. We talked about that already, in that animals, support animals need to be commonly domesticated animals, typically held in the home for purposes of pleasure and not commercial purposes. Snakes are not within that definition, neither are barnyard animals. So you'll get requests for chickens, you'll get requests for pigs. Those are considered to be, quote, unique animals. And while it's not an absolute bar, the law doesn't say you can't have a pig as an emotional support animal. You have to, it is up to the person asking for that animal to demonstrate the particular reasons why they have to have that animal. And those specific reasons would have to be verified by the third party. So it's a pretty high bar. And I don't recall having seen a request for one of these, quote, unique animals that we felt had met that bar. So it would be unusual. Of course, you will get requests to waive fees and deposits and pet rent and all of that. You have to do that if you've approved the animal as an assistance animal, whether it's a service animal or a support animal. You cannot charge fees or deposits or extra rent for that animal. It's perfectly okay, though, to insist that the animal be licensed, as your local authorities require that kind of animal to be licensed. For instance, rabies shots and whatever inoculations that they are required to have by the local authorities. You can insist on that, and you can insist on proof of that. You can ask for a photo of the animal, and you could ask that the animal be spayed or neutered. It probably should say or rather than and. You wouldn't do both, but you can ask that the animal be spayed or neutered. And unless there is some medical reason with the animal not able to be spayed or neutered, that's a perfectly valid request. I mean, realize that an emotional support animal is not intended to breed. Its purpose is not to produce little emotional support animals. And so there's no reason not to spay or neuter it. And certainly it's the responsible thing to do, and it will prevent you from having a whole apartment full of little emotional support animals. So that's a perfectly valid request. What about your pet rules? So first of all, your pet rules, you might want to consider calling them animal rules, because there will be people who will say, well, my emotional support animal is not a pet, and so I don't have to follow these rules. And in fact, assistance animals do have to follow the rules that you commonly set up for pets, with the exception of the fees and the deposits and the financial issues. Other than that, all the rules with regard to restraint, the animal has to be either on a leash under the control of a responsible person or caged whenever it's outside of the home. Hygiene, they can do their business in particular places unless it's not reasonable for the person with a disability to get there. Certainly the person with the animal will have to clean up after that animal, and the animal can't be a nuisance. It can't, for instance, bark all night or be vicious or aggressive. And those are all common pet rules that would apply to an assistance animal as well. An assistance animal, though, can go pretty much anywhere in the community that the resident can go. There are some exceptions, such as the animal can't be on a surface where food is served. The animal can't be in the pool. It can be in the pool area, at the pool deck, again under restraint or caged, but it cannot be in the pool itself. So there are very, very narrow circumstances where the assistance animal can't go everywhere that the resident can go. But other than that, the pet rules pretty much apply. And so I would consider calling them animal rules, and make sure that anyone who gets an ESA, an approved ESA or an approved service animal, is well aware of what those rules are.